Foreword. Rules? More rules, really? Isn't life complicated enough, restricting enough without abstract rules that don't take our unique, individual situations into account? And given that our brains are plastic and all develop differently based on our life experiences, why even expect that a few rules might be helpful to us all? People don't clamor for rules, even in the Bible. As when Moses comes down the mountain after a long absence, bearing the tablets inscribed with 10 commandments, and finds the children of Israel in revelry. They'd been Pharaoh's slaves and subject to his tyrannical regulations for 400 years. And after that, Moses subjected them to the harsh desert wilderness for another 40 years to purify them of their slavishness. Now, free at last, they're unbridled and have lost all control as they dance wildly around an idol, a golden calf, displaying all manner of corporeal corruption. "I've got some good news. I've got some bad news," the lawgiver yells to them. "Which do you want first?"
The good news,
the hedonists reply. "I got him from 15 commandments down to 10.
Hallelujah!
Cried the unruly crowd.
And the bad?
Well, adultery is still in. So, rules there will be, but please, not too many. We are ambivalent about rules, even when we know they're good for us. If we are spirited souls, if we have character, rules seem restrictive, an affront to our sense of agency and our pride in working out our own lives. Why should we be judged according to another's rule? And judged we are. After all, God didn't give Moses the 10 suggestions. He gave commandments. And if I'm a free agent, my first reaction to a command might just be that nobody, not even God, tells me what to do, even if it's good for me. But the story of the golden calf also reminds us that without rules, we quickly become slaves to our passions. And there's nothing freeing about that. And the story suggests something more. Unchaperoned and left to our own untutored judgment, we're quick to aim low and worship qualities that are beneath us. In this case, an artificial animal that brings out our own animal instincts in a completely unregulated way. The old Hebrew story makes it clear how the ancients felt about our prospects for civilized behavior in the absence of rules that seek to elevate our gaze and raise our standards. One neat thing about the Bible story is that it doesn't simply list its rules as lawyers or legislators or administrators might. It embeds them in a dramatic tale that illustrates why we need them, thereby making them easier to understand. Similarly, in this book, Professor Peterson doesn't just propose his 12 rules, he tells stories too, bringing to bear his knowledge of many fields as he illustrates and explains why the best rules do not ultimately restrict us, but instead facilitate our goals and make for fuller, freer lives. The first time I met Jordan Peterson was on September 12, 2004. At the home of two mutual friends, TV producer Wojtek Zemberg and the medical internist Esther Abekier. It was Wojtek's birthday party. Wojtek and Esther are Polish emigre who grew up within the Soviet Empire, where it was understood that many topics were off limits, and that casually questioning certain social arrangements and philosophical ideas, not to mention the regime itself, could mean big trouble. But now, host and hostess luxuriated in easygoing, honest talk by having elegant parties devoted to the pleasure of saying what you really thought and hearing others do the same, in an uninhibited give and take. Here the rule was, speak your mind. If the conversation turned to politics, people of different political persuasions spoke to each other, indeed looked forward to it, in a manner that is increasingly rare. Sometimes Wojtek's own opinions or truths exploded out of him, as did his laugh. Then we'd hug whoever had made him laugh or provoked him to speak his mind with greater intensity than even he might have intended. This was the best part of the parties, and this frankness and his warm embraces made it worth provoking him. Meanwhile, Esther's voice lilted across the room on a very precise path towards its intended listener. Truth explosions didn't make the atmosphere any less easygoing for the company. They made for more truth explosions, liberating us and more laughs and making the whole evening more pleasant. Because with de-repressing Eastern Europeans like the Zemberg Bekiers, you always knew with what and with whom you were dealing, and that frankness was enlivening. Honoré de Balzac, the novelist, once described the balls and parties in his native France, observing that what appeared to be a single party was always really two. In the first hours, the gathering was suffused with bored people posing and posturing, and attendees who came to meet perhaps one special person who would confirm them in their beauty and status. Then, only in the very late hours, after most of the guests had left, would the second party, the real party, begin. Here the conversation was shared by each person present, and open-hearted laughter replaced the starchy airs. At Esther and Wodek's parties, this kind of wee hours of the morning disclosure and intimacy often began as soon as we entered the room. Wodek is a silver-haired, lion-maned hunter, always on the lookout for potential public intellectuals who know how to spot people who can really talk in front of a TV camera and who look authentic, because they are. The camera picks up on that. He often invites such people to these salons. That day, Wodek brought a psychology professor from my own University of Toronto who fit the bill. Intellect and emotion in tandem. Wodek was the first to put Jordan Peterson in front of a camera and thought of him as a teacher in search of students, because he was always ready to explain, and it helped that he liked the camera, and that the camera liked him back. That afternoon there was a large table set outside in the Zemberg Becker's garden. Around it was gathered the usual collection of lips and ears and loquacious virtuosos. We seemed, however, to be plagued by a buzzing paparazzi of bees, and here was this new fellow at the table, with an Albertan accent, and cowboy boots, who was ignoring them and kept on talking. He kept talking while the rest of us were playing musical chairs to keep away from the pests, yet also trying to remain at the table because this new addition to our gatherings was so interesting. He had this odd habit of speaking about the deepest questions to whoever was at this table, most of them new acquaintances, as though he were just making small talk. Or if he did do small talk, the interval between, how do you know Wodek and Estera? Or, I was a beekeeper once, so I'm used to them. And more serious topics would be nanoseconds. One might hear such questions discussed at parties where professors and professionals gather, but usually the conversation would remain between two specialists in the topic, often a corner, or if shared with the whole group, it was often not without someone preening. But this Peterson, though erudite, didn't come across as a pedant. He had this enthusiasm of a kid who had just learned something new and had to share it. He seemed to be assuming, as a child would, before learning how dull adults can become, that if he thought something was interesting, then so might others. There was something boyish in the cowboy, in his broaching of subjects as though we had all grown up together in the same small town, or family, and had been thinking about the very same problems of human existence all along. Peterson wasn't really an eccentric. He had sufficient conversational chops, had been a Harvard professor, was a gentleman, as cowboys can be, though he did say "damn" and "bloody" a lot in a rural 1950s sort of way. But everyone listened, with a fascination on their faces, because he was in fact addressing the questions of concern to everyone at the table. There was something freeing about being with a person so learned, yet speaking in such an unedited way. His thinking was motoric. It seemed he needed to think aloud, to use his motor cortex to think. But that motor also had to run fast to work properly, to get to liftoff. Not quite manic, but his idling speed revved high. Spirited thoughts were tumbling out, but unlike many academics who take the floor and hold it, if someone challenged or corrected him, he really seemed to like it. He didn't rear up and neigh. He'd say in a kind of folksy way, "Yeah," and bow his head involuntarily, wag it if he had overlooked something, laughing at himself for overgeneralizing. He appreciated being shown another side of an issue, and it became clear that thinking through a problem was, for him, a dialogic process. One could not but be struck by another unusual thing about him. For an egghead, Peterson was extremely practical. His examples were filled with applications to everyday life. Business management, how to make furniture, he made much of his own. Designing a simple house, making a room beautiful, now an internet meme, or in another specific case related to education, creating an online writing project that kept minority students from dropping out of school by getting them to do a kind of psychoanalytic exercise on themselves in which they would free associate about their past, present, and future, now known as the self-authoring program. I was always especially fond of Midwestern prairie types who come from a farm where they learned all about nature, or from a very small town or have worked with their hands to make things, spent long periods outside in the harsh elements, and are often self-educated and go to university against the odds. I found them quite unlike their sophisticated but somewhat denatured urban counterparts, for whom higher education was preordained, and for that reason sometimes taken for granted, or thought of not as an end in itself, but simply as a life stage in the service of career advancement. These Westerners were different, self-made, unentitled, hands-on, neighborly, and less precious than many of their big city peers, who increasingly spent their lives indoors manipulating symbols on computers. This cowboy psychologist seemed to care about a thought only if it might, in some way, be helpful to someone. We became friends. As a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who loves literature, I was drawn to him because here was a clinician who also had given himself a great books education, and who not only loved soulful Russian novels, philosophy, and ancient mythology, but who also seemed to treat them as his most treasured inheritance. But he also did illuminating statistical research on personality and temperament and had studied neuroscience. Though trained as a behaviorist, he was powerfully drawn to psychoanalysis with its focus on dreams, archetypes, the persistence of childhood conflicts in the adult, and the role of defenses and rationalization in everyday life. He was also an outlier in being the only member of the research-oriented Department of Psychology at the University of Toronto who also kept a clinical practice. On my visits, our conversations began with banter and laughter. That was the small-town Peterson from the Alberta hinterland. His teenage years right out of the movie Fubar, welcoming you into his home. The house had been gutted by Tammy, his wife, and himself, and turned into perhaps the most fascinating and shocking middle-class home I had seen. They had art, some carved masks, and abstract portraits, but they were overwhelmed by a huge collection of original socialist, realist paintings of Lenin and the early communists commissioned by the USSR. Not long after the Soviet Union fell, and most of the world breathed a sigh of relief, Peterson began purchasing this propaganda for a song online. Paintings lionizing the Soviet revolutionary spirit completely filled every single wall, the ceilings, even the bathrooms. The paintings were not there because Jordan had any totalitarian sympathies, but because he wanted to remind himself of something he knew he and everyone would rather forget. That over 100 million people were murdered in the name of a utopia. It took getting used to. This semi-haunted house decorated by a delusion that had practically destroyed mankind. But it was eased by his wonderful and unique spouse, Tammy, who was all in, who embraced and encouraged this unusual need for expression. These paintings provided a visitor with the first window into the full extent of Jordan's concern about our human capacity for evil in the name of good, and the psychological mystery of self-deception. How can a person deceive himself and get away with it? An interest that we share. And then there were also the hours we'd spend discussing what I might call a lesser problem. Lesser because rarer. The human capacity for evil for the sake of evil. The joy some people take in destroying others, captured famously by the 17th century English poet John Milton in Paradise Lost. And so we'd chat and have our tea in his kitchen underworld, walled by this odd art collection, a visual marker of his earnest quest to move beyond simplistic ideology, left or right, and not repeat mistakes of the past. After a while, there was nothing peculiar about taking tea in the kitchen, discussing family issues, one's latest reading with those ominous pictures hovering. It was just living in the world as it was, or in some places is. In Jordan's first and only book before this one, Maps of Meaning, he shares his profound insights into universal themes of world mythology and explains how all cultures have created stories to help us grapple with, and ultimately map the chaos into which we are thrown at birth. This chaos is everything that is unknown to us, and any unexplored territory that we must traverse, be it in the world outside or the psyche within. Combining evolution, the neuroscience of emotion, some of the best of Jung, some of Freud, much of the great works of Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, Solzhenitsyn, Eliade, Newman, Piaget, Frey, Frankl, Maps of Meaning, published nearly 2 decades ago, shows Jordan's wide-ranging approach to understanding how human beings and the human brain deal with the archetypal situation that arises whenever we, in our daily lives, must face something we do not understand. The brilliance of the book is in his demonstration of how rooted the situation is in evolution, our DNA, our brains, and our most ancient stories. And he shows that these stories have survived because they still provide guidance in dealing with uncertainty and the unavoidable unknown. One of the many virtues of the book you're reading now is that it provides an entry point into Maps of Meaning, which is a highly complex work because Jordan was working out his approach to psychology as he wrote it. But it was foundational because no matter how different our genes or life experiences may be, or how differently our plastic brains are wired by our experience, we all have to deal with the unknown, and we all attempt to move from chaos to order. And this is why many of the rules in this book, being based on Maps of Meaning, have an element of universality to them. Maps of Meaning was sparked by Jordan's agonized awareness as a teenager growing up in the midst of the Cold War that much of mankind seemed on the verge of blowing up the planet to defend their various identities. He felt he had to understand how it could be that people would sacrifice everything for an identity, whatever that was. And he felt he had to understand the ideologies that drove totalitarian regimes to a variant of that same behavior, killing their own citizens. In Maps of Meaning, and again in this book, one of the matters he cautions readers to be most wary of is ideology, no matter who is peddling it or to what end. Ideologies are simple ideas disguised as science or philosophy that purport to explain the complexity of the world and offer remedies that will perfect it. Ideologues are people who pretend they know how to make the world a better place before they've taken care of their own chaos within. The warrior identity that their ideology gives them covers over that chaos. That's hubris, of course, and one of the most important themes of this book is set your house in order first, and Jordan provides practical advice on how to do this. Ideologies are substitutes for true knowledge, and ideologues are always dangerous when they come to power, because a simple-minded, I-know-it-all approach is no match for the complexity of existence. Furthermore, when their social contraptions fail to fly, ideologues blame not themselves, but all who see through the simplifications. Another great U of T professor, Louis Fourier, in his book Ideology and the Ideologists, observed that ideologies retool the very religious stories they purport to have supplanted, but eliminate the narrative and psychological richness. Communism borrowed from the story of the children of Israel in Egypt, with an enslaved class, rich persecutors, a leader like Lenin who goes abroad, lives among the enslavers, and then leads the enslaved to the promised land, the utopia, the dictatorship of the proletariat. To understand ideology, Jordan read extensively about not only the Soviet Gulag, but also the Holocaust and the rise of Nazism. I had never before met a person, born Christian and of my generation, who was so utterly tormented by what happened in Europe to the Jews, and who had worked so hard to understand how it could have occurred. I too had studied this in depth. My own father survived Auschwitz. My grandmother was middle-aged when she stood face to face with Dr. Josef Mengele, the Nazi physician who conducted unspeakably cruel experiments on his victims, and she survived Auschwitz by disobeying his order to join the line with the elderly, the gray and the weak, and instead slipping into a line with younger people. She avoided the gas chambers a second time by trading food for hair dye so she wouldn't be murdered for looking too old. My grandfather, her husband, survived the Mauthausen concentration camp but choked to death on the first piece of solid food he was given just before Liberation Day. I relate this because years after we became friends, when Jordan would take a classical liberal stand for free speech, he would be accused by left-wing extremists as being a right-wing bigot. Let me say, with all the moderation I can summon, at best, those accusers have simply not done their due diligence. I have. With a family history such as mine, one develops not only a radar, but underwater sonar for right-wing bigotry. But even more important, one learns to recognize the kind of person with the comprehension, tools, goodwill, and courage to combat it. And Jordan Peterson is that person. My own dissatisfaction with modern political science's attempts to understand the rise of Nazism, totalitarianism, and prejudice was a major factor in my decision to supplement my studies of political science with the study of the unconscious, projection, psychoanalysis, the regressive potential of group psychology, psychiatry, and the brain. Jordan switched out of political science for similar reasons. With these important parallel interests, we didn't always agree on the answers, thank God, but we almost always agreed on the questions. Our friendship wasn't all doom and gloom. I have made a habit of attending my fellow professors' classes at our university, and so attended his, which were always packed, and I saw what now millions have seen online. A brilliant, often dazzling public speaker who was at his best riffing like a jazz artist. At times he resembled an ardent prairie preacher, not in evangelizing, but in his passion, in his ability to tell stories that convey the life stakes that go with believing or disbelieving various ideas. Then he just as easily switched to do a breathtakingly systematic summary of a series of scientific studies. He was a master at helping students become more reflective and take themselves and their futures seriously. He taught them to respect many of the greatest books ever written. He gave vivid examples from clinical practice, was appropriately self-revealing, even of his own vulnerabilities, and made fascinating links between evolution, the brain, and religious stories. In a world where students are taught to see evolution and religion as simply opposed by thinkers like Richard Dawkins, Jordan showed his students how evolution of all things helps to explain the profound psychological appeal and wisdom of many ancient stories, from Gilgamesh to the life of the Buddha, Egyptian mythology, and the Bible. He showed, for instance, how stories about journeying voluntarily into the unknown, the hero's quest, mirror universal tasks for which the brain evolved. He respected the stories, was not reductionist, and never claimed to exhaust their wisdom. If he discussed a topic such as prejudice, or its emotional relatives fear and disgust, or the differences between the sexes on average, he was able to show how these traits evolved and why they survived. Above all, he alerted his students to topics rarely discussed in university, such as the simple fact that all the ancients, from Buddha to the biblical authors, knew what every slightly worn-out adult knows, that life is suffering. If you are suffering, or someone close to you is, that's sad. But alas, it's not particularly special. We don't suffer only because politicians are dim-witted, or the system is corrupt, or because you and I, like almost everyone else, can legitimately describe ourselves in some way as a victim of something or someone. It is because we're born human that we are guaranteed a good dose of suffering. And chances are, if you or someone you love is not suffering now, they will be within 5 years, unless you are freakishly lucky. Rearing kids is hard, work is hard, aging, sickness, and death are hard. And Jordan emphasized that doing all that totally on your own without the benefit of a loving relationship or wisdom or the psychological insights of the greatest psychologies only makes it harder. He wasn't scaring the students. In fact, they found this frank talk reassuring because in the depths of their psyches, most of them knew what he said was true, even if there was never a forum to discuss it. Perhaps because the adults in their lives had become so naively overprotective that they deluded themselves into thinking that not talking about suffering would in some way magically protect their children from it. Here he would relate the myth of the hero, a cross-cultural theme explored psychoanalytically by Otto Rank, who noted, following Freud, that hero myths are similar in many cultures, a theme that was picked up by Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell, and Eric Newman, among others. Where Freud made great contributions in explaining neurosis by, among other things, focusing on understanding what we might call a failed hero story, that of Oedipus, Jordan focused on triumphant heroes. In all these triumph stories, the hero has to go into the unknown, into an unexplored territory, and deal with a great new challenge and take great risks. In the process, something of himself has to die or be given up so that he can be reborn and meet the challenge. This requires courage, something rarely discussed in a psychology class or textbook. During his recent public stand for free speech and against what I call forced speech, because it involves a government forcing citizens to voice political views, the stakes were very high. He had much to lose, and knew it. Nonetheless, I saw him, and Tammy for that matter, not only display such courage, but also continue to live by many of the rules in this book, some of which can be very demanding. I saw him grow from the remarkable person he was into someone even more able and assured, through living by these rules. In fact, it was the process of writing this book and developing these rules that led him to take the stand he did against forced or compelled speech. And that is why, during those events, he started posting some of his thoughts about life and these rules on the internet. Now, over 100 million YouTube hits later, we know they have struck a chord. Given our distaste for rules, how do we explain the extraordinary response to his lectures, which give rules? In Jordan's case, it was of course his charisma and a rare willingness to stand for a principle that got him a wide hearing online initially. Views of his first YouTube statements quickly numbered in the hundreds of thousands. But people have kept listening because what he is saying meets a deep and unarticulated need. And that is because, alongside our wish to be free of rules, we all search for structure. The hunger among many younger people for rules, or at least guidelines, is greater today for good reason. In the West, at least, millennials are living through a unique historical situation. They are, I believe, the first generation to have been so thoroughly taught two seemingly contradictory ideas about morality simultaneously at their schools, colleges, and universities by many in our own generation. This contradiction has left them at times disoriented and uncertain, without guidance, and more tragically deprived of riches they don't even know exist. The first idea or teaching is that morality is relative, at best a personal value judgment. Relative means that there is no absolute right or wrong in anything. Instead, morality and the rules associated with it are just a matter of personal opinion or happenstance, relative to or related to a particular framework, such as one's ethnicity or one's upbringing or the cultural or historical moment one is born into. It's nothing but an accident of birth. According to this argument, now a creed, history teaches that religion, tribes, nations, and ethnic groups tend to disagree about fundamental matters, and always have. Today, the postmodernist left makes the additional claim that one's group morality is nothing but its attempt to exercise power over another group. So the decent thing to do, once it becomes apparent how arbitrary your and your society's moral values are, is to show tolerance for people who think differently and who come from different, diverse backgrounds. That emphasis on tolerant is so paramount that for many people one of the worst character flaws a person can have is to be, quote-unquote, judgmental. And since we don't know right from wrong or what is good, just about the most inappropriate thing an adult can do is give a young person advice about how to live. And so a generation has been raised untutored in what was once called aptly practical wisdom, which guided previous generations. Millennials, often told they have received the finest education available anywhere, have actually suffered a form of serious intellectual and moral neglect. The relativists of my generation and Jordan's, many of whom became their professors, chose to devalue thousands of years of human knowledge about how to acquire virtue, dismissing it as passé, not relevant, or even oppressive. They were so successful at it that the very word virtue sounds out of date, and someone using it appears anachronistically moralistic and self-righteous. Starred note on the word judgmental. Some argue, mistakenly, that Freud, often mentioned in these pages, contributed to our current longing for a culture, schools, and institutions that are quote-unquote non-judgmental. It is true that he recommended that when psychoanalysts listen to their patients in therapy, they be tolerant, empathetic, and not voice critical, moralistic judgments. But this was for the express purposes of helping patients feel comfortable in being totally honest, and not diminish their problems. This encouraged self-reflection, and allowed them to explore warded-off feelings, wishes, even shameful antisocial urges. It also, and this was the masterstroke, allowed them to discover their own unconscious conscience and its judgments, and their own harsh self-criticism of their own lapses, and their own unconscious guilt, which they had often hidden from themselves, but which they often formed the basis of their low self-esteem, depression, anxiety. If anything, Freud showed that we are both immoral and more moral than we are aware of. This kind of quote-unquote non-judgmentalism in therapy is a powerful and liberating technique or tactic, an ideal attitude when you want to better understand yourself. But Freud never argued, as do some who want all culture to become one huge group therapy session, that one can live one's entire life without ever making judgments or without morality. In fact, his point in Civilization and its Discontents is that civilization only arises when some restraining rules and morality are in place. Continuation. The study of virtue is not quite the same as the study of morals, right and wrong, good and evil, Aristotle defined the virtues simply as the ways of behaving that are most conducive to happiness in life. Vice was defined as the ways of behaving least conducive to happiness. He observed that the virtues always aim for balance and avoid the extremes of the vices. Aristotle studied the virtues and the vices in his Nicomachean Ethics. It was a book based on experience and observation, not conjecture, about the kind of happiness that was possible for human beings. Cultivating judgment about the difference between virtue and vice is the beginning of wisdom, something that can never be out of date. By contrast, our modern relativism begins by asserting that making judgments about how to live is impossible, because there is no real good and no true virtue, as these two are relative. Thus, relativism's closest approximation to virtue is tolerance. Only tolerance will provide social cohesion between different groups and save us from harming each other. On Facebook and other forms of social media, therefore, you signal your so-called virtue, telling everyone how tolerant, open, and compassionate you are, and wait for likes to accumulate. Leave aside that telling people you're virtuous isn't a virtue, it's self-promotion. Virtue signaling is not virtue. Virtue signaling is, quite possibly, our commonest vice. Intolerance of others' views, no matter how ignorant or incoherent they may be, is not simply wrong. In a world where there is no right or wrong, it is worse. It is a sign you are embarrassingly unsophisticated or possibly dangerous. But it turns out that many people cannot tolerate the vacuum, the chaos, which is inherent in life, but made worse by this moral relativism. They cannot live without a moral compass, without an ideal at which to aim in their lives. For relativists, ideals are values too, and like all values, they are merely relative and hardly worth sacrificing for. So, right alongside relativism, we find the spread of nihilism and despair, and also the opposite of moral relativism, the blind certainty offered by ideologies that claim to have an answer for everything. And so we arrive at the second teaching that millennials have been bombarded with. They sign up for a humanities course to study the greatest books ever written, but they're not assigned the books. Instead, they are given ideological attacks on them, based on some appalling simplification. Where the relativist is filled with uncertainty, the ideologue is the very opposite. He or she is hyperjudgmental and censorious, always knows what's wrong about others and what to do about it. Sometimes it seems the only people willing to give advice in a relativistic society are those with the least to offer. Modern moral relativism has many sources. As we in the West learned more history, we understood that different epochs had different moral codes. As we traveled the seas and explored the globe, we learned of far-flung tribes on different continents whose different moral codes made sense relative to or within the framework of their societies. Science played a role too by attacking the religious view of the world and thus undermining the religious grounds for ethics and rules. Materialist social science implied that we could divide the world into facts, which we all could observe and were objective and real, and values, which were subjective and personal. Then we could first agree on the facts and maybe one day develop a scientific code of ethics, which has yet to arrive. Moreover, by implying that values had a lesser reality than facts, science contributed in yet another way to moral relativism, for it treated value as secondary. But the idea that we can easily separate facts and values was and remains naive. To some extent, one's values determine what one will pay attention to and what will count as fact. The idea that different societies had different rules and morals was known to the ancient world too, and it is interesting to compare its response to this realization with the modern response, relativism, nihilism, and ideology. When the ancient Greeks sailed to India and elsewhere, they too discovered that rules, morals, and customs differed from place to place, and saw that the explanation for what was right and wrong was often rooted in some ancestral authority. The Greek response was not despair, but a new invention, philosophy. Socrates, reacting to the uncertainty bred by awareness of these conflicting moral codes, decided that instead of becoming a nihilist, a relativist, or an ideologue, he would devote his life to the search for wisdom that could reason about these differences, i.e., he helped invent philosophy. He spent his life asking perplexing, foundational questions such as, what is virtue? And How can one live the good life? And what is justice? And he looked at different approaches, asking which seemed most coherent and most in accord with human nature. These are the kinds of questions that I believe animate this book. For the ancients, the discovery that different people have different ideas about how, practically, to live did not paralyze them, it deepened their understanding of humanity, and led to some of the most satisfying conversations human beings have ever had about how life might be lived. Likewise, Aristotle. Instead of despairing about these differences in moral codes, Aristotle argued that though specific rules, laws, and customs differed from place to place, what does not differ is that in all places human beings, by their nature, have a proclivity to make rules, laws, and customs. To put this in modern terms, it seems that all human beings are, by some kind of biological endowment, so ineradicably concerned with morality that we create a structure of laws and rules wherever we are. The idea that human life can be free of moral concerns is a fantasy. We are rule generators, and given that we are moral animals, what must be the effect of our simplistic modern relativism upon us? It means we are hobbling ourselves by pretending to be something that we are not. It is a mask, but a strange one, for it mostly deceives the one who wears it. Scratch the most clever postmodern relativist professor's Mercedes with a key, and you will see how fast the mask of relativism, with its pretense that there can be neither right or wrong, and the cloak of radical tolerance come off. Because we do not yet have an ethics based on modern science, Jordan is not trying to develop his rules by wiping the slate clean, by dismissing thousands of years of wisdom as mere superstition and ignoring our greatest moral achievements. Far better to integrate the best of what we are now, learning with the books human beings saw fit to preserve over millennia, and with the stories that have survived, against all odds, time's tendency to obliterate. He is doing what reasonable guides have always done. He makes no claim that human wisdom begins with himself, but rather turns first to his own guides. And although the topics in this book are serious, Jordan often has a great fun addressing them with a light touch, as the chapter headings convey. He makes no claim to be exhaustive, and sometimes the chapters consist of wide-ranging discussions of our psychology as he understands it. So why not call this book of guidelines a far more relaxed, user-friendly, and less rigid-sounding term than rules? Because these really are rules. And the foremost rule is that you must take responsibility for your own life, period. One might think that a generation that has heard endlessly from their more ideological teachers about the rights that belong to them would object to being told that they would do better to focus instead on taking responsibility. Yet, this generation, many of whom were raised in small families by hyper-protective parents on soft surface playgrounds and then taught in universities with safe spaces where they don't have to hear things they don't want to, schooled to be risk-averse, has among it now millions who feel stultified by this underestimation of their potential resilience and who have embraced Jordan's message that each individual has ultimate responsibility to bear. That if one wants to live a full life, one first sets one's own house in order, and only then can one sensibly aim to take on bigger responsibilities. The extent of this reaction has often moved both of us to the brink of tears. Sometimes these rules are demanding. They require you to undertake an incremental process that over time will stretch you to a new limit. That requires, as I've said, venturing into the unknown. Stretching yourself beyond the boundaries of your current self requires carefully choosing and then pursuing ideals. Ideals that are up there, above you, superior to you, and that you can't always be sure you will reach. But if it's uncertain that our ideals are attainable, why do we bother reaching in the first place? Because if you don't reach for them, it is certain you will never feel that your life has meaning. And perhaps because, as unfamiliar and strange as it sounds, in the deepest part of our psyche, we all want to be judged. Dr. Norman Deutsch, MD, is the author of The Brain That Changes Itself.